Next. Now, why China was special. Now, transnational corporations had started moving their labor-intensive processes to developing countries to counter the fall in the rate of profit since the early 1970s. But China was special. Um, First of all, here was a large labor pool previously unintegrated into capitalism that started from a very low wage base and was relatively sealed off from immediate market pressures for wage increases, but owing to its very existence and impact on investment decisions, exerted downward pressure on global wage rates in manufacturing. In the first decade of the 21st century, China was to release an enormous 121 million workers to its manufacturing and service sectors. Second, China had a large reservoir of rural labor that, via migration to the cities, would serve as an internal check on wage rates in the cities. In the 2000 decade, more than 80 million rural people went to the cities to fill urban jobs. So a consistent pressure on wage rates to keep low. Now, several conditions external to China facilitated its phenomenal ascent. First was the fact that China appeared on the scene as the provider of the cheapest accessible labor around a time that the US corporate elite was tearing up its informal social contract with labor that had prevailed during the so-called 30 golden years of capitalism from the late 40s to the late 70s. Second, China's emergence as an export-led industrial power coincided with the TNC's perfection of revolutionary technology of dispersing the different phases of production according to the complementary logics of labor cost reduction, locational advantage, and fiscal advantage to gain maximum profitability, a process that came to be known as, quote, the value chain. A key innovation here was the development of containerized shipping. Third, China benefited from the bringing down of tariffs and elimination of quotas that came with the establishment of the World Trade Organization, which China joined with the US virtually acting as a wedding sponsor in 2001. Unlike the Western capitalist powers during their rise to dominance, China did not have to violently seize markets. While the China-US TNC alliance was based on mutual interest, their strategic goals were different. The TNCs were out to exploit Chinese labor for super profits. China offered its manufacturing labor force for exploitation, but its goal was to gain the investment and technology to comprehensively develop the economy. Essentially, in pursuit of this strategic goal, the Chinese leadership used foreign investment as a substitute for a domestic capitalist class. US economic and political elites were behind this deal until Trump came into office. Next, please. From the Communist Party's perspective, the cost in the short and medium term of allowing global capital to exploit China's labor in return for comprehensive development of the economy and securing its own legitimacy in the process was a devil's bargain that had been worth entering. In any event, by the end of the second decade of the 21st century, the importance of Beijing's corporate allies had been reduced by the combination of a decade-long stagnation, followed by a COVID-19 recession in the US market, and China's own technological advances, though there were areas where selected American high-tech companies remained important. What made the difference? The difference was a strong state emerging from an anti-imperialist revolution, not the state of a defeated power like Japan or that of a protectorate like South Korea. South Korea and Japan, are usually seen as the developmental states par excellence. China had a state that was far stronger than them because of its having come out of an anti-imperialist revolution. Now, eager to take advantage of wages that were about 2.9% of those of the US, American transnationals essentially moved a great many of their manufacturing processes to China. China's rapid industrialization was thus related to the US's deindustrialization, particularly in the Midwest. This was in turn the law of global capital working itself out. That is, the integration of non-capitalist social modes of production to counter the fall in the rate of profit. Now, this does not mean, that there were no crises in China, but these were crises of growth, as I call it. First, there was the rise in different dimensions of inequality, income, gender, etc. There was, a proliferation of environmental crisis. There was the problem of overcapacity or surplus capacity that, was a drag on China's manufacturing base. There were multiple protests. In fact, the image that there were no protests or very few protests in China is certainly not true. Until 2008, there were thousands of grassroots protests. Now, the difference was that, and there still are, the difference, of course, is that there was no systemic challenge to the Communist Party. Why the absence of a systemic challenge? While inequality has indeed grown, incomes have risen even faster. Average per capita income in China rose between 1988 and 2008 by 229%, 10 times the global average of 24%, and far ahead of the rates for India, 34%, and other developing Asian economies. Quote, for most of the past 3 decades, all boats have been rising, unquote, one analyst speculates. Quote, and most people pay more attention to their own boat than the boats that have risen higher. They may, in short, have bought into Deng Xiaoping's motto early in the reform era that some people and some regions should be allowed to prosper before others, unquote. Now, what we had in the US, in contrast to crises of growth in China, were crises of decline. Long before the banking collapse of 2008, key US industries such as machine tools, consumer electronics, auto parts, appliances, furniture, telecommunications equipment, and many others that had once dominated the global marketplace suffered their own economic collapse. While not all moved to China, moving to China was a central factor in deindustrialization. The so-called China shock is estimated conservatively to have led to the loss of 2.4 million American jobs. Most likely, the number of jobs lost was much higher. Rise of inequality in the United States, to which deindustrialization was a central contributor, owing to the loss of well-paid manufacturing jobs. But this was not the only reason, and one must see the rise in inequality as a product of neoliberal policies as a whole. Let me quote the French
Deixa eu
economist.
falar aqui o que o francês economista falou. Eu quero enfatizar que a palavra colapso
The bottom 50% of the income distribution claimed around 20% of the national income from 1950 to 1980, but that share has been divided almost in half, falling to just 12% in 2010 to
Em
2000.
2010 a 2015. A
1%
partir
share has moved in the opposite direction from barely 11% to more than 20%. Quote, unquote. Yeah, next
eu estou
slide.
falando.
Okay.
Ok.
In addition to this crisis,
Além dessa crise de industrialização,
ideological crisis in the United States. The political crisis is the undeclared civil war that has severely damaged the US political system as the majority population embraces white supremacy. People now call this the Cold Civil War. Second is the ideological crisis, the loss of the American dream, and what we had termed missionary democracy, the sense that the US role in the world was, to expand liberal democracy. That's gone. There is an inward turning, though the left and the right differ on what inward turning consists of. The momentous US defeat in Afghanistan can only accelerate this process of political and ideological disaggregation. Now, unlike in the US, China, though
assim como nos Estados Unidos,
industrialization, was not suffering from
associé à une industrialisation vertigineuse,
Western-style democracy were a very small minority, though spontaneous feelings of alienation against the authorities were expressed widely on the internet. Then we might note Xi Jinping's ideological renovation that he has emphasized. And this has consisted principally of an anti-corruption campaign, promotion of the Chinese dream of shared prosperity, and also quite important, national rejuvenation, meaning ending, moving from the century of shame, which was the 19th century to the mid 20th century, and on to a new phase in China's history. And finally, we have, in the case of China, a push for global leadership, leadership of the process of globalization, promotion of the idea of connectivity linking the Eurasian landmass, and the biggest example of this is the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, one key reason China prospered was because of its slow spending on defense during its decades of industrialization, a strategy that then Chinese President Hu Jintao described as China's peaceful rise in the early 2000s. Instead of being preoccupied with building up its military might, China has focused on opening markets in Africa and Latin America and becoming a source of billions of dollars of development aid, even as US bilateral economic aid has been neglected in favor of ever-increasing military assistance and subsidized weapon sales to old allies like Israel, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. The launching of the Beijing-sponsored Asian Infrastructure Development Bank in 2014 saw even the US traditional allies in Europe queue up to become partners. More governments from both the Global South and the Global North signed mass, Africa, and Latin America. Now, Donald Trump's policy towards China constituted a break with a 20-year-old US policy of placing the interests of US transnational corporations as a primary consideration. Trump, advised by economic nationalists like Peter Navarro, went for a strategy of punishing Beijing economically via trade sanctions, an aggressive effort to change its state-led capitalist mode of production, and executive directives to prevent the transfer of American high tech. The Biden administration is likely to continue this strategy, but add a new element: heavy state spending to shore up the US's technological superiority. A few days ago, a few weeks ago, the US Senate passed a $250 industrial policy bill. This was a lopsided bipartisan vote that showed that containing China is probably the only area where Republicans and Democrats can agree. Now, with the US suffering from a prolonged economic crisis owing to deindustrialization and financialization, and from an undeclared social and political civil war that is bringing everything into gridlock, the only area where the US enjoys undisputed superiority over China is on the strategic front. Maintaining superiority on this front, as well as I would strongly contend that the conjunction of the loss of global economic hegemony, debilitating political and ideological crisis, and massive military superiority is a very dangerous one. The danger comes not from the fact that China is modernizing its military, as the US Department of Defense claims, but that China is so far behind militarily. Let me explain. In his speech at the 19th National Congress of the Communist Party of China on October 18, 2017, the famous Chinese Dream speech, Xi Jinping laid out a three-stage schedule for China's military modernization, ending in 2049 with the achievement of the military into world-class forces, unquote, that could, quote, manage crisis and deter and win wars, unquote. One can read that assertion as Xi's admission that the People's Liberation Army was some 30 years behind the US military, the universally regarded as the world-class standard. In my view, it was a mistake to admit this, and I shall explain why after we have compared the military capabilities of the US and China. How do the US and China's armed forces compare today? Well, in 2019, US military expenditures were about 3 times more than China's, $732 billion to $261 billion. The rise in military spending by the US was 5.3% from its level in 2018, while that of China was 5.1%. US officials now routinely describe China as a near-peer competitor. This is grossly inaccurate if we use nonpartisan indicators. First of all, in terms of nuclear weapons, Beijing has a relatively small nuclear force that is guided by a no first use doctrine.
Pequena, que é guiada por uma doutrina de não
Via the
Une doctrine du non-recours.
Mantención de una capacidad retaliatoria de segundo ataque. Los Estados Unidos tienen capacidades superiores, muy superiores nucleares, y no adoptar una posición de NFU.
260 nuclear warheads, while at the end of 2017, the US arsenal contained approximately just under 1,400 deployed and approximately 4,000 stockpiled warheads. Second, China's conventional defense offensive capabilities are grossly inferior to that of the US. Two key indicators of a country's offensive capability are its overseas bases and its aircraft carriers. China has only one overseas military base, and that is located in Djibouti, off the Gulf of Aden, from which it participates in anti-piracy activities. The US has scores of military bases surrounding China, 25 major bases and 60 other facilities spread all over Japan, 15 bases in South Korea, 3 bases in Guam, and 5 bases in the Philippines. In terms of aircraft carriers, China has 2 operational carriers with an antiquated Soviet-era design, while the US has 11 carrier task forces, one of them, the 7th Fleet, based in Yokosuka, Japan, which can easily be supplemented by another carrier task force from the Eastern Pacific in the event of conflict. US carriers like the recently commissioned USS Gerald Ford are the state of the art, far in advance of anything China has to offer. Even the strategic postures, even the Pentagon does not dispute Beijing's strategic posture as strategic defense, which it describes is rooted in a commitment not to initiate armed conflict, but to respond robustly if an adversary challenges China's national unity, territorial sovereignty, or interests, unquote. The US strategic posture, on the other hand, is offensive. It has 3 components. One is forward deployment, that is to push the US presence of US military power as far as possible from the territorial limits of the US and as near as possible to the borders of a likely enemy. Second is a warfighting doctrine called Air-Sea Doctrine. A key document explicitly points to China as the enemy, and it calls for, quote, kinetic and non-kinetic, in other words, both explosive and electronic strikes against inland command centers, radar systems, and intelligence gathering facilities, raids against missile production and storage operations, and blinding operations against Chinese satellites. It also says that China's seaborne trade flows would be cut off with an eye towards exerting major stress on the Chinese economy and eventually internal stress, unquote. Third, the US long-term strategic perspective is overmatched. According to our friend Mike Clare, quote, although reminiscent of containment in some respects, overmatch differs from Cold War strategy not only because it presumes 2 and possibly more major competitors instead of just one, but also because it requires a perpetual struggle for dominance in every realm, including in trade, energy, and technology. Now, China's strategic dilemma is that large parts of the US military forces in the Western Pacific lie right on its doorstep, entrenched in bases on the so-called First Island chain, or at sea in the forward deployed US 7th Fleet. Most of China's industrial infrastructure and population are located in the country's southeastern and eastern coasts, and thus are very vulnerable to US power in the event of conflict. China's response to this dilemma has been to push its defense outwards, placing anti-access, anti-denial weapons, A2AD, in maritime formations like Mischief Reef that it seized in the South China Sea from countries like the Philippines. These moves have been justified unilaterally by saying that 90% of South China Sea belongs to China. China's claim to 90% of the South China Sea is illegal and violates the rights of 5 other countries that border that body of water. The US has long seen the South China Sea as part of the American lake, and its surface ships and submarines patrol the area with impunity up to just outside China's 12-mile territorial waters, while its intelligence gathering aircraft also lurk as close to China as possible, surveying every square meter of ocean and coast. While China advances territorial claims, the US advances the doctrine of freedom of navigation to advance its interests. Be that as it may, US-China jockeying for power in the South China Sea is creating a very explosive situation since there are no rules of the game except an informal balance of power. And resorting to balance of power as a regulator of conflict is quite unreliable, as was seen in the case of the European balance of power that resulted in the First World War. Right now, US and Chinese ships are engaged in provocative games of chicken, in which jet fighters buzz enemy ships or warships head for their rivals, then swerve at the last minute. When I visited Vietnam as a member of Congress in 2014, Vietnamese officials expressed as to how a mere ship collision could escalate into a bigger conflict. And I have no doubt they are right, since both China and the US are viewing their maneuvers in the West Philippine Sea or South China Sea within a larger regional and global chessboard. The West Philippine South China Sea could be the site for a much bigger confrontation. In my writings, I have put forward a 4-step plan under the auspices of ASEAN towards a de-escalation of conflict in the area. And I will not go through this. We can discuss that later. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay. Clausewitz famously wrote that war is the extension of politics by other means. This gives too much weight to rational calculus as the process of determining when to go to war. It grossly underestimates the role of passion. But what is truly dangerous is when passion is joined to rational calculus, such as when the desire to maintain hegemony is attached to a calculable process of when to go to war. Xi Jinping's estimate at the 19th Congress that it will be in mid-century that China will have a world-class forces that can match those of the United States has perhaps unwittingly given the Pentagon a sense that it has at most a 30-year window of opportunity, most likely less, to do something. That is what I meant about Xi's making a mistake in his 19th Party Congress speech. Will the Pentagon really allow Beijing to achieve strategic equality, which may well be the last step to America's loss of global hegemony? Next slide, please. Am I exaggerating? The US has probably been the most warlike country over the last 245 years, constantly expanding and taking over territory through military adventures in its first 150 years, then using military force to achieve and maintain military hegemony for the next 100 years. There have been few periods where this country has not been at war. This country, in fact, was continually at war over the last 20 years. And we're not sure if, in fact, the Afghanistan war, from its point of view, has ended. Compare this to China, which last deployed troops outside its borders 40 years ago. Indeed, the big fear of the Chinese is that their forces do not have the experience of war making that the US has, which would be decisive in any conflict. Let me end by citing Graham Allison, the Dean of Security Studies Establishment in the US, who says that China and the US are on a collision course for war. To many, a preemptive move on the part of the United States, given its bellicose history, is a given. The question is not whether, but when, where, and how it will take place. This presentation is based on my piece at the Summit of Global Capitalism's Accommodation, Rivalry, or Confrontation between the US and China. That is appearing in the Socialist Register of 2022, which has just been published, by the way, and made available. Those who friends who would like to request the PDF of this article can write me at waldenbello@yahoo.com, and I'll definitely send you the PDF. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Walden. According to the fact that you are in the Philippines, meaning that it's almost 1 o'clock morning for you. Thank you again. And I saw that some people wanted to react, but I propose to pass.
E nós vamos agora ter a Martin Boulard.
Maintenant, on va entendre Martin Boulard.
Martin, you have the floor.
Piso para discusiones. Martin.
Martin, ton micro.
Oui, excusez-moi. Donc, merci beaucoup. Merci de m'avoir invité. J'ai trouvé l'intervention de Walden vraiment très, très intéressante. Je ne sais pas s'il y aura...
Não sei se haverá uma guerra quente, mas
Il y a
Bueno,
de raison pour aller vers un affrontement. Je voudrais revenir très, très, très rapidement.
To a confrontation. We're going to go through things very quickly because we don't have much time. I'd like to go through the relations between China and the US. There are different ones we know. The last 2 years were important for the United States to recognize China in 1972.
C'est-à-dire que du
em
point de vue
Pequim, ou seja, do ponto de vista
de rejeter la Chine communiste. Ce n'est
Oh, to say communist China, the United States, which were they were in the Vietnam War and they needed to opponent such as the Soviet Union, and it allowed us to bring these funds again together. There was a second period between the United States and China.
Évidemment, la Chine n'avait pas de capitaux, mais elle avait une main-d'œuvre qui était formée quand même. C'était une main-d'œuvre alphabétisée par rapport à l'Inde.
She had all this qualification, and after that, she had these forces all integrated, well done, and by then, we had an ideological aspect, not only economical aspect, it was strategic. We could have, and you could take China to a capitalist system. And in this democracy, entirely concerned, this is a disappointment, total disappointing within these ideologies, because there was this prosperity of the United States, and it happened from the United States. So when the China accepts the capital, the American capital, developed, and then they develop the countries, they have the independence, but it's fragile at the end of the day. In the beginning of the 90s, you have a percentage of the amount in China. We had an additional taxation due to the United States. So China didn't get the return of the knowledge that it was being constructed. So you had to have the foreign capital, and then China had to really get this capital, and then you could develop. It's necessary to say that in 1989, we had the repression, and there was modernizing current in China, say that the country should get ready, you know, with all the apparatus. And then you could have the first reform. And we had an American economic massacre. It means that you are not going to receive the Westerners anymore. And I remember that very well, that I had a Chinese economist say that you said what you have to do, and this is liberalism, so on and so forth. Now you know what it means. Now it's time to get the leadership.
Ils n'y arrivent toujours pas complètement, c'est le moins qu'on puisse dire. Et puis, il y a eu une espèce de...
Because we had something that didn't work well. And there was a kind of a, let's say, safety. They had safety that was much more affirmed. So we had a relaunch of the United States, considering that at the time they could do better. And China, on the other hand, also began to impose itself, and then it became safe. So these weaknesses of China, the United States used to feel stronger, but China was becoming more equal. The loss of the fear of a loss of identity was too strong regarding China. The United States were afraid to, China was afraid to absorb this capitalism ideology. In 2011, the United States was, they didn't know, they were not opened only by Trump, but by Biden as well. So because they would operate a form that would start to talk about an Asian pivot, and all of its bases in Asia. Therefore, 2 years later, after Obama decided to become enlisted, these military people that are going to find in Asia, in a political Asia, was the first. On the second mandate of Barack Obama, there was something there. Actually, it was used in China, and what began with Obama. France gets in later as well, and they start to consider also other strategies. So we are going to work with this theoretical system from Obama, and Trump comes closing everything, surrounding everything, and he's going to close up the commercial war towards something that would satisfy what China was suffering, and also the United States. So
le protectionnisme, entre guillemets, chinois. C'est là, évidemment, que
of the United States, and
E há uma convergência já
en los demócratas y los republicanos en relación a esa necesidad de sobrevivir al comercio y a la industria china, pero también
des élus démocrates, et cette loi nationale sur la défense, loi nationale de défense, dit clairement
go up to a powerful position. Clearly, France says that China lives a systemical war. We're going to watch now here a struggle between Republicans and Democrats. And today we see clearly a loss of a notion of war with Biden. I'm sorry, by Trump, of Trump and Biden. Biden works more with human rights from the international point of view to effectively have a practice to work more, the access of pacification between Japan, India, Australia, and the United States, with an idea of this military Chinese content. In other words, it is an international policy of Joe Biden and NATO will have their right to speak against China, and this is very dangerous on the security level. Chinese people, we said this a lot, is going to emerge as a power. We have seen in the last few years the diplomacy, and in the last few years we can see using a diplomatic language, they are going to work with great diplomatic positions, Chinese, before the US advancements. I'm going to go through this quickly. I'm going to talk about the occupation and development of this part of China. And there is a very clear will that is not justified, on the contrary of the international right. But China, international law, sorry. When we see China's map, it's completely covered up in the north with South Africa, where we have American exchanges, and there's a portion of Japan that has hundreds of kilometers of their territory, and that also has American troops. It also has the Republican of Cameroon that is going to have this access to this passage towards the sea. In other words, it's not going to justify, one more time, that they're going to shoot these islands that are developed like the Philippines. But this explains, doesn't justify, it's not the best solution, of course, but it is a consequence of becoming alienated of what could be allies. Therefore, the closest ones to China that have this kind of aggressiveness, this is the aggressive aspect. The other aspect is regarding control, which was more developed in relation to China. I'm going to take this title. We talk about this new Cold War. Can we really talk about a new Cold War? I don't know exactly. Because in the Cold War, there was competition between two economical systems, the capitalist system, but however, the capitalist system in the beginning, these capitalist systems, they have a system that is liberal in the United States with these economical activities, and in China, there was a great liberty for the capital. We have seen evidently that they cut the wings of great multinational companies, and so they were developed there. And this is an interesting discussion because there is a new regulation that exists to the point there they have proposed a new coin for this giant, financial giant. When we were talking about that the Amazon would be a new coin, and especially there were two interdependent economies, China is the first supplier to the US and the first buyer of US products. So we could not imagine that the Soviet Union that supplied American products would work strictly. The Soviet Union was a giant in terms of weapons. And on the second part, there is a very strong Cold War, which is commercial and technological. And maybe all of this. Christophe, let me know if I'm over my time. No, you still have 5 minutes. Maybe a technological war, commercial war that can bring coups that are very strong against the government when Taiwan comes out of Chinese soil. It was an essential producer, a necessary one. In China, of course, it truly has a delay, and there is an influential war. We were talking about the initiative. I don't know, it's very complicated to talk about all of this topic and initiatives. We talked about $5 million, the projects in the United States, etc. But really, what happens is that politically, there is an investment of structures in Asia. Second, they thought about not making an intervention. In projects, I guess it is a very profound thing. This was a very systematic project of infrastructure. It was well thought. And afterwards, finally, to work with a certain equipment, what remains out of all this? We can say that we have an influence on Africa and in some countries to show that they could work with a multilateral project. The Asian countries are going to work with infrastructure projects that allowed, in practice, a definition, a border definition among countries, the allied countries. From the economical point of view, they could also show that they were capable. The famous agreement, they could elaborate the famous agreement, the regional and global agreement with South Korea, among other countries. They could have points over their economical influence. Of course, we have some weak points. For example, the repression that can block part of the projects, but with all this, with Japan, sorry, this Chinese threat is real. However, the majority of the Asian countries know that the United States are going to work on this war against China strategically, and we need, frankly, to work on this diplomatic comprehension. In other words, we have to think about this fire war that is very close to us. We have components. We have to continue to talk about this, but to sum up, if American people, the Americans cannot work together with Asia, we are going to get closer to a force, if I may say. China could not be redeveloped. In other words, there are some points, evidently, that they have lost when Taiwan was out. So I didn't talk about Taiwan because I don't have time, but I invoke Taiwan because it is the weak spot of China. And this is here that maybe they could work as a very sensitive point. Are we going to have a hot war, a warm war? I don't believe it, actually, at first. This First World War was not rational. Nobody's going to agree with it. But on the other hand, there are American maneuvers that are going to work with extremely dangerous strategies and that are going to lead to a development of a warm or hot war. Thank you very much, Martin, for your presentation. Martin?
I saw Carlos Mendoza Portela, and I saw Pierre Baudet. But before them, I have two questions by mail or chat. The first one came from...
J'ai deux questions.
Essa pergunta é sobre a China e a Índia. Por que a China não se torna uma
in this growing China-USA conflict?
Pourquoi la Chine ne devient pas un allié important?
USA camp. That's the first question.
Esa es la primera pregunta, viniendo de Ferrol.
Question, which are in fact two questions coming from Oli Milan Campos, which is in the chat, but in Spanish. I translated in English. He asked two questions. The first one is to know if we can say that the US is a declining empire and China a rising empire. And his second question is about the relationship between China and Russia. Do you think that China is worried by the link and the relationship between China and Russia? That are the three first questions. Now I will give the floor to Carlos Mendoza Portela, then to Pierre Baudet, and then to Zé Correa, who just raised his hand. Carlos Mendoza, ¿estás aquí? ¿Puedes hablar? Okay, we'll see later. I don't see his hand still on, but if he wants, he can speak in a while. Pierre Baudet now, you have the floor, and then Zé Correa, and then Carlos Mendoza, if he reappears.
Okay, thank you, Christophe. Thank you for Walden and Martin. Outstanding presentation. Really, bravo. I want to raise a tough question because it relates to what happened the last month. I'm talking, of course, about the Afghan debacle, and it's a bit early, a bit this and that. So one interpretation is that it's an important defeat, perhaps not a strategic defeat, but important defeat of the United States, especially at the symbolic level. Okay, it's humiliating. And it sends the message that, the United States cannot control Afghanistan and before that, Iraq. And what are they going to do? It's unclear. There are some reactions in the United States, et cetera, et cetera. For first reaction, it's a defeat. They're going to pay the cost and it helps China also on the side through Afghanistan and Pakistan. Second interpretation is that, it's good riddance. The United States are relief to handle this mess, this chaos, extremely costly, without an end in sight. And it goes to Obama's initiative that says, okay, forget the Middle East and let's go Asia, that kind of stuff. And also in terms of the military doctrine, it's over the period of the soldiers in the ground, and we will defeat them by the drones and etc., etc., etc. And just to end, that China, which appears as they made some success with that, will pay because the United States will not leave Afghanistan and Pakistan and through the different projects just to go like this, and they will try to undermine this with whatever means they are possible. So two interpretation. Maybe there's a third, fourth. So I'd like to hear you on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Pierre. Ze Korea, you have the floor.
I will speak slowly in Portuguese to be translated, okay, to English and French.
I'd like to thank you very much.
C'est les présentations
y de Martini son muy útiles
to understand our globe today. The first question, the analysis of Walden, it is the lack of effectiveness of this conflict between the United States and China. It seems to me that is very connected to the situation of expansion of the Sea of China in this existing conflict with Taiwan. But I would like to point out two other issues. I see them as problems, actually, for us to discuss. First, what is the level of interdependence of the Chinese economy and Japanese economy, Korean, and China itself? So what's the level of interdependence? Is it that big that makes it impossible to have a conflict in a global level? I'm not just taking out Walden specific conflicts, particular hard conflicts, but I'm talking about global conflict. Don't you think that is going to be self-destructive for all players? This is the first point, first question. Second question, this projection of power that China is doing in the relations with Russia and occupying the empty spaces left by the United States. What I'm thinking, Myanmar one side and Afghanistan and Pakistan on the other side. Actually, the situation geopolitically of Eurasia is not so favorable to China. This is the second question. The third question is, it is something that you cannot get rid of. What is Latin America in this projections in terms of Chinese power, according to you guys both? What are your opinions about that? Thank you very much. This is my questions for you too. Thank you.
There is a question from Menahem in the chat. You can read it in English. At the moment where we have the 20th anniversary of September 11, Do we think that the US military-industrial complex could use the threat of terrorism by pushing out the pressure to Xi Jinping to consolidate the development of his business, as he did 20 years ago? That is this question. I remind you, if you have people wanting to ask a question, is the moment to do it, because the first question, written question, or the discussion we just hear about are very important. And if there is no other remarks or question, I will pass the floor to our two panelists, Walden and Martin, to hear what they have to tell us about all these issues. We do that? No more question? Okay, Walden, if you can try to answer in a short way to these very deep issues were on the table, you have the floor, and then Martin.
Yes, let me see. So you can hear me. Yes, thank you for the questions. Thank you, Martin, for the presentation. I will, of course, try to integrate all the questions into a couple of answers. First, I think that we should expect, that the U.S. will, in fact, try to strengthen its alliances in South Asia, especially with India. Okay, given the debacle in Afghanistan, and certainly I think that under the BJP government, the alliance between the U.S. and India is seen as a strategic one. So there's both the idea of containing China's influence in South Asia, but also I think there is an ideological element to it, which is that the drive of the BJP is to say that it can be as efficient or create a society as efficient as China, but not become an authoritarian regime like China. So yes, we can be like China, but at the same time, we need not abandon our practices of whatever they call it, democracy, although the BJP is, has moved very far away from the secular democracy of of Nehru and Gandhi. So basically that relationship will be strengthened in light of the Afghan debacle. So the second thing is, I think Zhe was asking about China's relationship with Japan, South Korea, and ASEAN. Well, basically, I think what we now have in that part of the world is what is called a sinocentric division of labor. Pretty much, we have an integrated regional economy, that has been created over the last 2.5 decades. That's very clear with South Korea. That's very clear with ASEAN. And basically, for instance, with ASEAN, it's the manufacture of parts and the provision of raw materials that are then converted into industrial and manufacturing products that they are then exported to third countries like the United States. At least when the export-oriented strategy of China was still, at its height, there was, in fact, this regional division of labor that had developed. So these economies are very much interdependent with one another. Of course, there is also the question of continuing interdependence with Europe and the United States, okay? But I think it would be reductionist to say that just because there is economic interdependence, that nullifies the possibility of political conflict, because that's certainly not true historically. Germany was very much integrated into the British-led Western European economy before the First World War. I mean, the trade relations were very, very intense. For instance, between Germany and Britain, and certainly leading up to the Second World War, we also saw Germany's economy very much integrated up to the late 30s, with the rest of Western Europe, and indeed had very strong ties to the United States, because some very famous U.S. corporations, including Ford, had very strong ties to the German military-industrial complex. So basically, I guess what I'm trying to say is that political and ideological relations, which can lead to conflict, have a great deal of relative autonomy from economic relations. And I think it would, so I think that is no guarantee. Closeness of economic relations, mutual dependence is not a guarantee that conflict will not emerge. The situation that Per has raised is, well, clearly, I think Afghanistan was a big debacle at so many levels, and it's that war was lost long ago. Afghanistan was lost as early as 2006, 2007. And it was just really a holding operation. Basically, I think, Trump was right. Trump was right to make the deal. And the US military tried to prevent that deal from taking place. And the US military also tried to prevent an early withdrawal under Biden. And I think that's very clear from the records at this point in time. So I think the big question we have to ask is, what are going to be the geopolitical implications of this? Well, I think that we had already seen under Obama, as Martin had raised, that the US was just desperate to get out of being embroiled in the Middle East, because it was, there was no sight, there was no exit in sight. And here was a possibility of moving the focus to the Asia Pacific, where the US conventional forces were much more suited for a confrontation rather than the asymmetrical warfare taking place and the US was losing in the Middle East. So Obama's pivot to Asia was really, in many ways, a retreat. My sense is, as I said earlier, the only area at this point where the U.S. really maintains, a clear-cut superiority is in military. At every level, there's just no comparison, and I would imagine at this point, that there is some serious strategic thinking going on in the U.S. that while we maintain this superiority and we have a 30-year window, if Xi Jinping is right, that parity from the position of the Chinese won't be achieved till 2049, then there is that window of opportunity that might be, is a very dangerous one from my point of view, because I think what you have now is a situation where you have, decline is never an easy process for any superpower to admit. And I think that, as I said, when you join passion for hegemony to rational calculus, to maintain hegemony, then you have the worst of all possible worlds for the world. So, so my sense is, that we really need to look at the military strategic front as a very volatile one. And again, my sense.
Novamente, o que eu acho é que
The US does not
os americanos
Les Américains,
take easily to defeat. It is the most
ils sont pas faciles à vaincre.
over the last 250 years. It has now suffered two major defeats in Vietnam, in the Middle East, in Afghanistan. And defeat is not in the national character. So I would say that I do not think that the Biden administration is, going to lead to an era of peace. Okay. However, there are other factors at work, and but how much will this distract from the U.S. position of global hegemony? Now, the other factors at work is the state of near civil war in the United States. The U.S. is really, at a very, very intense domestic crisis at this point in time. That is basically driven by race. And one cannot underestimate the way that this polarization is in fact driving politics in the US and will have an impact in terms of foreign policy. Now, one possible impact of that is that the crisis becomes so severe, especially as the demographic balance in the US shifts away from the white population, that everything gets focused on the domestic front. Or the other possibility is that because there's so much domestic conflict, a nationalist kind of position of asserting or reasserting global hegemony might be a way by which some sectors of the US elite might want to unite politically or artificially create an artificial unity. And of course, this was the fascist solution during the Second World War for Germany. I think the German war of aggression was very much related to the internal class war in Germany. So I think we need to really look at how this very intense racially, and I think it's no doubt that race is the driving force at this point in the US. How is this going to impact in terms of the US's economic, political, and military aspects of its global dominance? So I'm not quite ready to say that it's going to go this way or that way, but certainly the one thing that is clear to me is more than ever, the domestic warfare and the foreign policy and military hegemony of the United States are very much interrelated at this point in time. I don't think we can divorce them from each other. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Walden. Now, Martin, if you want to react to the question where raised, ton micro. Martin, ton micro.
Du point de vue militaire, évidemment. C'est bon.
Da palestrante.
Oui, maintenant ça va. Vas-y, Martine. On ne t'entendait pas tout à l'heure, maintenant ça va.
Excuse-moi. Je disais, j'ai pas complètement américain.
Temos problema na transmissão.
Voilà. J'ai eu un problème de connexion. Vous m'entendez là?
A connection problem. Are you listening to me right now? Are you listening? Okay. Nice. Sorry, I have a connection problem. I was saying that I was not sharing the idea of an American decline, but maybe a relative decline. There is a competition to Chinese with the Chinese, but they have a bellical dominance. But research-wise, it is attractive. The amount of students, the amount of foreign students that go to America does not have to do with the amount of students that want to go to China, and we can multiply examples this way. So it's a relative decline. Of course, that the exit does not contribute to leave Americans very credible. And Chinese press took advantage of the moment to say that, look, what would happen with Taiwan if you get aligned with the United States? Look, Taiwan, this was said in the press. So there is a loss of credibility by the United States. Be careful with this decline matter. It is relative. The US declined. And another thing, India and Afghanistan, until now, the United States wanted to bring India behind them, but with a lot of difficulty. Of course, that India participated and still participates of the multilateral Pacific and Asia axis. Of course, this is very important. In April, there was a little misunderstanding between India and the US because of US Navy ships that entered the commercial and economical area, which is exclusive. in the Indian Sea, and this has brought protests from India. This is a very national area, and the idea to going into these areas without signaling, it resulted in a scandal in the Indian press, and this was the first aspect. And the second aspect is regarding China. We get to the same point every time. China is very close. The US are away, but China is very close. And for example, there was an incident in Himalaya last year, and since then, the Indian people negotiated with the Chinese. So if the Chinese had more abilities, this could calm down, and this should bring more concern to Indian people. So the agreement with the US was what happened with the Afghanistan. There is a struggle between Pakistan and India. In Afghanistan, Pakistan is afraid of where China is going to be. On the other hand, China is afraid of an agreement between Pakistan and Afghanistan, which could bring problems to the Kashmir region. You know that India and Pakistan had always had a conflict with Kashmir. So the weight of China plus Pakistan and Afghanistan might bring a concern for the Indian people, and this can bring them to go to the American side. But before putting itself behind the United States, have strong forces in India, despite the Indian nationalism, despite the anti-Chinese sentiment that there is in India. I think it's hard that India will be a secure ally for the United States. I don't believe this is going to happen. And the third point about Afghanistan and the consequences over United States and China is that we were talking about the role of China and with the Taliban, they received the Taliban, but it received them only one time after having an agreement with Biden and Trump. So on the contrary of Russia, however, there were discussions between the Taliban and the United States. There was a discussion with Khamenei, which is the ex-chief of Afghanistan, and the Russian chiefs. They were all there. All of this to say that China is observing this very carefully. They think that they have raw material, and they have started already to invest in bauxite, which is essential for new technologies. But India is a second country in the region of Afghanistan, and there is another process for China, which is much more important than the economical matters, which, how do you say, which is this Islam party, which has relations, and China is very much afraid of terrorist attacks from a political Islam in Al-Qaeda, and they have as basis Afghanistan.
Qu'à la Chine sur l'Afghanistan. Quant à la Chine-Pakistan, il faut se rappeler qu'effectivement, il y a ce fameux couloir dans le cadre des routes de la soie de développement entre la Chine et le Pakistan. Des projets ont été sérieusement réduits dernière période. Donc là aussi, ça avance, mais ça avance assez doucement.
With the advancement, it was a slow progress. I would like to say something about Japan. Japan was the first commercial partner of China, and China was the first commercial partner of Japan. Let's say it's kind of moderated. I will just close up with the China and Russia, not an alliance properly. But, you know, in the field of diplomacy of China is not to have alliances at all. It does not work like that. China has no alliance in the region. China has no alliance in the globe, has commercial relations, economical relations, sometimes a little bit more than that. And with Russia, the same thing. This is where Europe develops as a negative role, because Europe is going hands in hands with the United States. And with Russia, Europe rejected Russia to China, and Russia has contradictory interests with China within Asia and in this Asia field. So you have to understand these proper schemes that happened before. These are frustrating alliances of the interests right now. And you have ties between China and Russia. They have liberal regimes, economically speaking. Of course, that in Russia, you have sanctions, not in China, but there is no ideological alliance, but interests. It's not a military alliance in a classical sense.
Thank you for Walden, because it's almost 2 o'clock.
Oh, my God.
At the moment. Yeah, it's really very, very nice from you, very kind from you. I want also to thank the interpreters, because without them it would be impossible to have this really multinational, international.
Fantástico, senão a gente não conseguiria fazer esse webinar ser internacional.
And to tell you also,
Sinon, on ne pourrait pas emmener cette discussion dans tous les continents.
will be the US and Latin America. What is the new relationship after Trump, with the return of the left in different countries in Latin America? That is the topic. And the global dialogue will invite Maristella Zampa from Argentina, and Stefanini, a good analyst also, who will be the second panelist next week for this series of 3 webinars on the US after Trump. Thanks a lot. Only to tell you that we were all around 40 in the Zoom meeting, but we have a lot of people connected through the Facebook and YouTube Live in 4 languages, and a lot of feedback of people very happy of the quality of those exchanges. And again, it's a very warm welcome. Thank you to Walden and Martin. And have a good night, Walden, and have a good day or good evening for all the others. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good to see you.
Bye.
Bye.